Okay, picture the 1920s. You probably think flappers, jazz, maybe some hidden speakeasies, right?
Yeah.
Prosperity, big changes.
The roaring 20s.
But underneath all that sparkle, one of the biggest political scandals in American history was brewing. Seriously big. We're talking oil, power, secret deals.
And corruption on a scale that honestly still feels pretty shocking today.
It really does. It was so bad it actually put the first ever U.S. cabinet member in prison for things he did while he was in office.
Which is just incredible when you think about it. And this wasn't just, one rogue official.
Yep.
Teapot Dome, as it became known, it sort of ripped the lid off this whole network of cronyism.
Right.
It raised huge questions about money in politics, influence, how we manage things that belong to the public. And those questions, they feel incredibly familiar today, don't they? Themes like government transparency, special interests.
And the big one, public trust. Can you actually trust the people in charge?
Exactly. It keeps coming back to that.
So that's what we're going to do in this deep dive. We've got a stack of sources here, historical accounts, some really interesting academic research, especially on the financial markets back then. And we're going to unpack this Teapot Dome story for you. We want to get past the headlines, understand how the corruption worked, who the key players were.
And really connect the dots between this, century-old scandal and the conversations we're still having about power and integrity in government.
It's a fascinating story with long shadows. So let's get into it.
Let's do it.
Okay, first things first. To really grasp Teapot Dome, we need to understand the setting. What was America like in the early 1920s, and why was oil suddenly such a massive deal?
Well, as you said, it was the Roaring 20s, a time of huge change. World War I was over. The U.S. was stepping onto the world stage as a major power.
Right.
And that shift had big implications for national security, especially for the Navy.
Because the Navy was key back then, projecting power globally.
Absolutely. And there was this critical tech shift happening. The Navy was moving its entire fleet, these massive warships, from burning coal to burning oil.
That sounds like a huge undertaking.
It was enormous, and it meant a huge leap in performance speed, range, efficiency. But it also meant the Navy became totally dependent on having a reliable, secure supply of oil.
So oil wasn't just about the economy anymore. It was vital for defense.
Precisely. National defense. And the government, recognizing this, maybe a bit paranoid after the war, they decided to create what they called naval petroleum reserves.
Okay, what were those exactly?
Basically, specific areas of federal land owned by the public that were thought to have a lot of oil underground. The idea was to just leave it there, untouched.
Like an emergency stash.
Exactly. Keep it in the ground unless there was a national emergency, like another war, and the Navy desperately needed fuel.
Sort of a strategic underground savings account filled with oil?
That's a good way to put it. And the sources point to three main spots. Teapot Dome in Wyoming. It's got this famous rock formation that looks like a teapot, hence the name.
Okay.
And then two big ones in California, Elk Hills and Buena Vista Hills. Federal land, public resources.
Okay, so we've got this incredibly valuable strategic resource set aside for the Navy, sitting under public land. Now, bring in the politics of the early 20s.
Right. This is all happening under President Warren G. Harding. He takes office in 1921. Harding was maybe a bit of an unexpected president, came up through Republican ranks in Ohio, owned a newspaper.
Okay.
And one source makes a really crucial point about his election campaign. He got significant financial backing from some very powerful people in the oil industry.
The oil connection starts early. Money talks.
It often does. And the expectation, the source notes, was pretty clear. In return for that support, Harding was expected to appoint cabinet members who were, let's say, friendly to oil interests.
So right from the start, you've got this potential for conflicts of interest baked in. Campaign money, potentially influencing who gets put in charge of policy.
Exactly. And that dynamic, well, it definitely set the stage for what came next.
Yeah, that story feels depressingly timeless sometimes.
Yeah.
Okay, so with that political backdrop, who's the key player in Harding's cabinet, the one who ends up at the center of all this, let's talk about how the deal got cooked.
Right. That would be the Secretary of the Interior, Albert B. Fall.
Albert Fall.
Fall was a big deal in Republican circles, especially out west. He was from New Mexico, had been a U.S. senator. His background was all wrapped up in land and resources, lawyer, rancher, mining interests.
So a man very familiar with the value of land and what's underneath it.
Very much so. And crucially, he was close to President Harding personally.
Yeah, the sources mentioned poker games, whiskey, part of the inner circle.
Definitely part of Harding's social scene. Sometimes called the Ohio game, though Fall wasn't from Ohio. Harding is often described as, friendly, maybe a bit easygoing, trusting.
The go along to get along type mention.
Right. And it seems he placed a lot of personal trust in Fall. That friendship, that closeness was probably key to Fall's next move.
Which was getting his hands on those Navy oil reserves.
Yeah.
How did that happen?
Exactly. Even though these reserves were specifically for the Navy, under the Navy Department's control, Albert Fall managed to convince President Harding to issue an executive order in 1921.
An executive order.
Yes. And this order transferred control over all three reserves, Teapot Dome, Elk Hills, Buena Vista Hills, away from the Navy, and gave it to the Department of the Interior, Fall's department.
Wow. That seems significant. Why would Harding just sign off on that? Did Fall make a good case?
Well, the argument Fall apparently made was that his department, Interior, was just better suited to manage federal lands and the resources on them. More expertise, perhaps.
Okay.
But, critics then, and historians now, they point to other factors. The influence of the oil industry, Fall's own ambitions. Putting these incredibly valuable reserves under the control of someone with deep ties to oil and doing it through an executive order instead of, say, a debate in Congress. It definitely raised some eyebrows even at the time. Maybe not loudly enough at first, though.
So Fall now controls the keys to the kingdom, these strategic oil fields. Who were the oil guys eager to get in?
Two main figures emerge, and crucially, they were buddies of Albert Fall, old friends, the sources emphasize.
Of course they were. Who are we talking about?
Harry Sinclair, who ran Mammoth Oil Company, and Edward Doheny, the head of Pan American Petroleum Company, big players in the industry.
So Fall's old pals are running major oil companies, and Fall now controls the government's emergency oil reserves. You can see where this is going. How did the actual deals happen?
This is where the secrecy really kicks in. In 1922, Fall, using his new authority, leased the exclusive drilling rights for the entire Teapot Dome Reserve in Wyoming to Harry Sinclair's company, Mammoth Oil.
Exclusively. The whole thing.
The whole thing. And soon after, he did basically the same thing with the California reserves, Elk Hills and Buena Vista, which were actually much larger and potentially more valuable, leasing them exclusively to Edward Doheny's Pan American Petroleum.
And these weren't put out for public bid or anything, just handed over.
Handed over. Done secretly. No competitive bidding. Now, there's a nuance here that becomes important later in the legal fights.
Okay.
The Mineral Leasing Act of 1920 did technically allow the government to lease federal lands without competitive bids in certain situations. Like, if they argued it was needed to prevent oil from being drained away by wells on adjacent private land.
Ah, a potential loophole or justification, at least on paper.
Exactly. So the lack of bidding, while suspicious, wasn't automatically illegal on its face. They could try to argue it fit the criteria.
Okay, so the method might have been debatable legally, but the real heart of the scandal was something else.
Precisely. It wasn't about the bidding process itself, ultimately. The scandal, the real corruption, was about why these secret, non-competitive deals happened. And that brings us to the money.
Following the money. Always a good strategy in these situations.
Because, as one source puts it quite bluntly, these leases were lubricated.
Lubricated. I think I know what that means. Bribes. Big ones.
Very big ones. The sources lay it out pretty clearly. The most famous one involved Edward Doheny, the guy who got the California leases. In November 1921, not long after Fall got control of the reserves,
Yes.
Doheny gave Fall what he called a loan for $100,000.
$100,000. In 1921, what's that worth today?
You adjust that for inflation, you're looking at somewhere around $1.76 million in today's money.
Wow, $1.76 million. And it was a loan.
A loan, yeah. But the sources note it was delivered in cash, in a briefcase, and it was interest-free.
Okay, a briefcase full of cash, equivalent to over $1.5 million today, interest-free, going from the oil guy who just got a massive secret deal to the government official who approved it. That doesn't exactly scream standard financial transaction.
No, it really doesn't. Highly suspicious, to say the least. And that wasn't even everything.
There was more.
Oh, yeah. Fall got other significant payments and gifts from both Doheny and Harry Sinclair, the Teapot Dome guy. The total from both, including that initial $100, came to about $404,000.
So $404,000 back then. What's the total value today?
That $404,000 is roughly $7.12 million today. So add that to the first loan.
We're talking close to $9 million in today's money. Secretly passed from these oil barons to Albert Fall, the guy controlling access to these crucial national oil reserves.
It's staggering. It really drives home the point made by that historian quoted in one source. These officials weren't interested in the national interest. They were interested in their self-interest.
They were basically selling off public resources for personal profit.
It looks exactly like that, treating national assets like their own personal piggy bank to be cracked open.
And suddenly having, the equivalent of nearly $9 million appear. Someone must have noticed Fall was suddenly living large, right?
Yeah.
How did that part come out?
That's exactly how the suspicions really started to gain traction. Fall, before all this, wasn't known as a wealthy man. He had his ranch, but sources suggest he often struggled financially.
Okay.
Then, suddenly, after these leases are signed, his lifestyle changes dramatically. He starts spending money in ways that just didn't add up, paying off old debts, making big improvements to his property.
Like the story about him paying off years of back taxes on his ranch, up to 10 years worth.
Exactly that kind of thing. Buying more land, more livestock, significantly upgrading his whole operation. This sudden show of wealth, this opulence, it was pretty noticeable, especially locally.
Right.
And people started asking questions. A key figure who began writing about it, questioning where all this money came from, was Carl McGee, who later became a prominent newspaper editor known for fighting corruption.
So the flashy spending was a major red flag. And while Fall was getting rich, what was the benefit to the actual public from these deals? Were we getting good royalties or anything?
Almost nothing. The sources described the royalties paid back to the government as paltry. Just tiny amounts. The leases were clearly structured to benefit the oil companies and Fall, not the U.S. Treasury or the Navy's future energy security.
So massive private gain, minimal public benefit. It really underscores the self-interest angle, doesn't it?
Completely. It was a blatant disregard for the public good.
Okay, so Fall's getting rich. The deals are done in secret. Questions are starting to be asked. How did this bubble actually burst? How did it go from local whispers to a full-blown national scandal investigation?
Well, like a lot of big things, it apparently started with something relatively small. A different oil man, someone who didn't get one of these sweet deals.
A sore loser, maybe?
Perhaps. Or maybe just someone...
Just griped about it.
Yeah. And his complaint eventually made its way to Senator John B. Kendrick, who was a Democrat from Wyoming, where Teapot Dome is located.
Okay, the senator from the state involved.
Right. Kendrick saw the potential for serious wrongdoing involving public lands in his state. So in April 1922, he introduced a resolution in the Senate. It called for an official investigation into how these Naval Reserve leases were handled.
And the Senate agreed to investigate.
They did. The task fell to the Senate Committee on Public Lands and Surveys. Initially, it was chaired by Senator Robert M. La Follette Sr. from Wisconsin.
Fighting Bob La Follette, the famous progressive.
That's the one, a major reformer. Interestingly, though, La Follette apparently started out thinking Fall was probably innocent. Maybe thought it was just political mudslinging.
But something changed his mind pretty dramatically, didn't it?
Yes, something straight out of a political thriller. La Follette's Senate office was broken into, ransacked, files disturbed. It looked like someone was searching for documents related to the Teapot Dome investigation.
Wow. Someone broke into a senator's office. That's brazen.
Extremely. And that act seems to have convinced La Follette that this wasn't just politics, that something deeply corrupt was going on and that powerful people were trying to cover it up or obstruct the investigation.
That's incredible. So with La Follette now convinced, who really drove the investigation forward, it wasn't him in the end, was it?
No, while La Follette kicked it off and chaired initially, the real engine behind the investigation, the person who relentlessly pursued it for 2 long years, was Senator Thomas J. Walsh.
Thomas Walsh from Montana.
That's him, a Democrat, like Kendrick. And he was actually one of the most junior members of the committee, serving in the minority party. But he had this sharp legal mind and just wouldn't let go.
A junior senator taking on the establishment. That takes guts.
It really does. He led this grueling inquiry for 2 years, facing all sorts of obstacles.
Like what kind of obstacles?
Oh, you name it. Key records related to the leases and Fall's finances would just disappear. Witnesses would suddenly develop bad memories or just refuse to testify. There were attempts to smear Walsh and the committee publicly.
Sounds like a tough fight.
Definitely. But Walsh kept pushing, meticulously following the evidence, especially the money trail. The big question became, how did Albert Fall get so rich so fast on a public servant's salary? That's what Walsh zeroed in on.
And this wasn't the only shady stuff happening around the scandal, right? There was that incident with the Denver Post.
Ah, yes, that adds another layer of murkiness. According to our sources, the Denver Post got wind of some damaging information about Sinclair. They publicized part of it and then apparently used the threat of more negative editorials to basically pressure Sinclair.
Pressure him into what?
Into paying them, the newspaper, and another oil man $1 million. It sounds an awful lot like blackmail, using the threat of bad press related to the scandal to extract money.
So the guy accused of bribery was potentially being blackmailed himself. The irony.
It's quite something. And there are even hints, though maybe not concrete proof, that President Harding himself might have been involved in trying to manage the fallout.
Harding? How so?
Well, Harding was obviously very worried about the scandal hurting his administration. Sources suggest he might have quietly leaned on Sinclair to, take care of certain problems, maybe make payments to keep things quiet to avoid more bad press. It shows how high the anxiety levels were.
Understandable, given his connections to these guys. So with all this heat, the investigation digging, the press sniffing around, what happened to Albert Fall? Did he stick it out?
No, he didn't. In January 1923, as Senator Walsh's investigation was really gaining steam, Albert Fall resigned as Secretary of the Interior.
Has walked away.
He claimed it was for health reasons, wanting to go back to his ranch. But the timing, right in the middle of this intensifying scandal, made it pretty clear why he was leaving. And even after resigning, he apparently went right on working for Sinclair and Doheny, helping them pursue other lucrative oil deals. His ties remained strong, but his resignation didn't stop the Senate investigation. Walsh kept going.
Okay, so Fall is out, but the investigation continues. And this investigation itself, this process of Congress digging into potential corruption, actually led to a major legal fight with huge consequences, right? This is where we get into that landmark Supreme Court case.
Absolutely. This is one of the really lasting impacts of Teapot Dome that maybe doesn't get as much attention as the bribery itself. The scandal forced the Supreme Court to clearly define Congress's power to investigate.
But Congress had been doing investigations for ages, hadn't they?
Oh, sure. Investigating everything from military failures to financial panics, it was a long-standing practice. But the Constitution doesn't explicitly say Congress shall have the power to investigate.
Ah, it's an implied power.
Exactly. Courts had recognized it as necessary for Congress to do its main job, which is legislating. But there were questions about the limits. An old case from 1881, Kilburn v. Thompson, had suggested that investigations needed to be clearly tied to a potential law Congress might pass. They couldn't just be fishing expeditions to expose wrongdoing. They needed a specific legislative purpose.
Okay, so there needed to be a reason related to lawmaking. How did the Teapot Dome investigation bump up against that?
Well, as Senator Walsh's committee dug deeper, they started looking into the Justice Department itself, headed by Attorney General Harry M. Daugherty. There were suspicions about how his department was handling aspects of the scandal, and his brother was involved in some questionable banking activities.
Okay, looking into the top lawyer in the country.
Right. But the Senate resolution that authorized that part of the investigation didn't explicitly say we are investigating the Justice Department because we might pass a law reforming it. It just said basically investigate the conduct of the Justice Department regarding these matters.
And that lack of a specific legislative reason gave someone an opening to challenge it.
Precisely. The challenge came from Mally S. Daugherty, the Attorney General's brother. Mal Daugherty was president of a bank in Ohio, the Midland National Bank.
The brother with the questionable banking activities.
The very same.
Yeah.
The Senate committee suspected his bank records, maybe even safety deposit boxes or accounts showing large withdrawals, might hold clues about money connected to the scandal, possibly involving the Attorney General himself. So they ordered Mal Daugherty to appear and bring those records.
The smoking gun, perhaps. And did he?
Nope. He flat out refused. He challenged the Senate's authority to make him testify or produce the bank's records.
So what did the Senate do?
They flexed their muscle. They ordered the Senate sergeant-at-arms, basically, Congress's own law enforcement officer, to arrest Mal Daugherty and bring him before the committee.
Arrested by the Senate. Wow.
It's a dramatic move. But Daugherty wasn't intimidated. As soon as he was arrested, he filed a lawsuit challenging the whole investigation. He argued the Senate had no right because they hadn't stated a legislative purpose, and they were improperly acting like a court, trying to put his brother, the Attorney General, on trial.
And initially, the courts agreed with him.
They did. The lower federal court sided with Mel Dougherty. They said, yeah, based on that old Kilburn case, the Senate needed a clearer legislative goal here. And it did look a bit like they were trying to usurp the judiciary's role. If that ruling had stood, it would have severely weakened Congress's ability to oversee the executive branch.
So a huge potential blow to checks and balances. This obviously went higher.
All the way to the Supreme Court. The case became McGrain v. Dougherty, and the decision, when it came down in January 1927, was a big one.
What did the Supreme Court say?
It was unanimous. They completely reversed the lower courts. Justice Van Devanter wrote the opinion, and it strongly affirmed Congress's broad power to investigate.
So they said Congress can do this kind of investigation?
Yes. Emphatically, yes. The court basically said, look, the power to investigate is essential. It's a necessary part of the legislative function. How can Congress write good laws if it can't gather information?
Makes sense.
And crucially, they said investigating how executive departments, like the Justice Department, are operating and whether they're doing their jobs properly is plainly a subject Congress can legislate on. Therefore, investigating potential misconduct or inefficiency within those departments serves a valid legislative purpose, even if a specific law isn't mentioned in the resolution.
So oversight itself is inherently linked to the legislative role. Congress needs to know if the laws they passed are being executed properly or if new laws are needed.
Exactly. The McGrain ruling cemented that. It gave Congress broad discretion to decide what needs investigating, as long as it relates generally to its lawmaking responsibilities. It made it much harder for people to just refuse to cooperate with congressional investigations by claiming they weren't legitimate.
That's a really profound legacy from this scandal. It's strengthened Congress's hands significantly in holding the executive branch accountable.
It really did. As the sources point out, McGrain didn't invent the power, but it validated it, put it on solid legal ground, and removed a lot of the legal threats that could derail investigations. And its impact echoes down through the decades. It's been cited in countless major congressional probes ever since organized crime, McCarthyism, Vietnam, Watergate, right up to investigations in recent years. It ensured this crucial oversight tool remains strong.
Okay, so we've got the political drama, the bribes, the investigation, the landmark legal case. But Teapot Dome also gives us this unique peek into the financial world of the 1920s, specifically around insider trading, right? Before the SEC and modern rules.
Yeah, this is a really fascinating angle thanks to some academic research that looked closely at stock market activity during the scandal. It's like a time capsule showing how markets worked before the kind of regulation we take for granted today. The SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, wasn't even created until the 1930s, largely in response to the excesses that led to the 1929 crash, which scandals like Teapot Dome were arguably precursors to.
So back in the early 20s, there weren't really specific laws saying you can't trade stocks based on secret information you have.
Not in the way we think of it now. There were general anti-fraud laws, sure, but no specific agency or set of rules targeting insider trading using private knowledge about a company, or in this case, a government deal, to make profits on the stock market.
Okay, so what did this research find when they looked at the Teapot Dome deals and the stock market?
Well, one interesting point was that the markets back then didn't seem super efficient in the way economists use the term today. Publicly released news didn't always cause an immediate or sharp stock price reaction. Information didn't seem to spread or get priced in instantly like we often expect now.
So even public news took time to sink in. But what about secret private information? Like knowing about these oil leases before anyone else?
That's where they found something really striking. The study focused on the stock of Sinclair Consolidated Harry Sinclair's company, the one that got the Teapot Dome lease.
Right.
And the researchers found that Sinclair's stock price shot up significantly and unusually before the news about the secret lease deal became public knowledge.
How big of a jump are we talking? And when exactly?
The sources mention a 48% increase in Sinclair's stock price between February 3rd, 1922 and April 13th, 1922.
Okay, February to April 22. What's the significance of those dates?
February 3rd is right around the time the sources suggest the secret meetings and agreements about the Teapot Dome lease were being finalized between Fall and Sinclair. And April 13th is just before the Wall Street Journal actually broke the story publicly.
Wow. So in the 2 months between the secret deal being basically done and the public finding out, the stock of the company getting the deal jumped almost 50%.
Exactly. And to show just how unusual that was, the study compared it to the broader market, the Dow Jones Industrial Average, and also to a basket of other big oil company stocks, what they called the rivals.
And how did they do?
Over that same February to April period, the Dow and the rivals portfolio only went up about 13% or 14%.
Okay, that difference is huge. Sinclair's stock rose more than 3 times faster than its competitors and the market overall, precisely during the window when only insiders knew about this incredibly valuable government lease.
It's pretty compelling evidence, isn't it? It strongly suggests that people in the know, people with that private information, were buying Sinclair stock heavily before the news broke. They anticipated the price would jump once the lease became public, and their buying pushed the price up ahead of time.
Classic insider trading, just before there were rules against it. Can we even estimate how much money might have been made by these insiders?
The study tried to put a number on it. They looked at the holdings of major shareholders who were likely connected or were insiders themselves, their estimate. The raw increase in the value of those top shareholder stock during that pre-announcement period was about $11.23 million.
$11 million back then.
Yeah. And when you adjust that for inflation to, say, 2019 dollars, you're looking at potential gains of around $177.68 million. Just from that stock run-up fueled by secret information.
Almost $180 million in today's money. Just from knowing about the deal a couple of months early. That's incredible.
It really highlights the enormous financial advantage that kind of privileged information provided in an unregulated environment. The study even calculated what those same shareholders would have made if they'd just put their money in the other oil stocks, the rivals.
Yeah.
Their adjusted gains would have been closer to $50 million, so the insider knowledge gave them more than a 3 times greater return.
That really spells out the value of being on the inside. Now, was there anything at all back then, even without the SEC, that might have stopped these insiders from just completely exploiting this?
Interestingly, yes. The study suggests that even without formal regulations, something likely limited how much they could trade. Maybe the fear of discovery.
Fear of getting caught by Walsh's investigation, perhaps.
Exactly. Knowing a Senate investigation was brewing, or worrying that making huge, perfectly timed trades would look too suspicious, might have made them a bit cautious. They might have held back, traded less aggressively than they could have, just to avoid drawing attention.
So even the threat of oversight, the threat of being exposed, could act as a kind of informal check even before official rules were in place.
That's a fascinating point about accountability. Okay, let's move to the endgame. What finally happened to everyone involved? What were the ultimate outcomes?
Well, after all the investigations, the trials, the appeals, it took years, Albert Fall finally faced a reckoning. In 1929, he was convicted.
Convicted of what specifically?
Of accepting a bribe, specifically the $100,000 loan from Edward Doheny in exchange for the Elk Hills lease in California.
And that conviction was historic, right?
Absolutely historic. It made Albert Fall the first U.S. cabinet member ever sentenced to prison for felonies committed while holding office. He ended up serving about a year behind bars.
A grim first for American government.
Yeah.
And what about the leases themselves, the deals Fall made?
The court stepped in there too. Because of the proven fraud and corruption, the leases granted to Sinclair for Teapot Dome and Doheny for Elk Hills were declared illegal and voided. Control of those reserves went back to the federal government. So the public resources were clawed back, eventually. But what about the guys who paid the bribes? Sinclair and Doheny. Did they face the same justice as Fall?
And this is where the story gets, well, frustrating for many people. It's a point the sources highlight. While Fall was convicted for taking the bribe.
Let me guess. Sinclair and Doheny weren't convicted for paying it.
Largely no. Sinclair did end up serving some short jail time, but it was for contempt of Congress, basically obstructing the investigation, and later for contempt of court related to jury tampering in his bribery trial. But he was never convicted of the bribery itself. And Edward Doheny, he was actually acquitted of bribery charges in his criminal trial.
Wait, so the guy who gave the $100,000 bribe that Fall was convicted of taking was found not guilty of giving it. How does that work?
It seems baffling, doesn't it? It points to the complexities of proving bribery cases, maybe different standards of proof, different juries, or perhaps just the quality of legal defense money could buy. But the outcome certainly felt unbalanced. The bribe taker went to prison. The wealthy bribe givers essentially walked free on those charges.
That definitely leaves a bad taste. It raises serious questions about equal justice. What happened to the actual Teapot Dome oil field after all this drama?
Well, after the lease was canceled, the Teapot Dome field was basically shut down. It sat idle for almost half a century, 49 years.
Wow.
It wasn't until 1976 that the government started pumping oil from it again, managing it directly. And over the years it operated, it did generate significant revenue for the Treasury, about $569 million.
And what's its status now?
The final chapter came in 2015. Almost a century after the scandal first broke, the federal government finally sold the Teapot Dome oil field. And the sources make a point of saying this time it was sold on the level, meaning through a transparent, open, competitive bidding process, no secret deals. It sold for $45.2 million. A stark contrast to how things were handled back in 1922.
A very different process indeed. What about the political fallout for the Harding administration? Of course, Harding himself died in office in 1923, right, if things were really heating up.
Yes, Harding's sudden death meant he avoided facing the full political storm directly, though the scandal obviously tarnished his administration's legacy badly. His vice president, Calvin Coolidge, took over.
Silent Cal. Was he implicated at all?
No, Coolidge was seen as completely clean in relation to Teapot Dome. And interestingly, the scandal almost worked to his advantage politically.
How so?
Because the corruption happened before he became president, and the investigations, especially Senator Walsh's determined pursuit of the truth, highlighted the misconduct of the previous administration. This actually boosted Coolidge's image as this honest, steady, uncorrupt figure, exactly what the public seemed to want after the scandal. It probably helped him win the 1924 election quite easily.
Huh. So the scandal that brought down his predecessor actually polished his own reputation.
Yeah.
Politics is strange. This whole saga, it really feels like it gets to the heart of the relationship between people and their government, doesn't it? Especially around trust.
Absolutely. Teapot Dome wasn't just some isolated incident. It was this huge public exposure of cronyism, of insiders enriching themselves using public assets. Even back then, it tapped into this deep vein in American culture, a kind of inherent skepticism about concentrated power.
Yeah, one of our sources from Brookings talks about that, right?
Right.
That a suspicion of state power has been part of the American DNA right from the Revolution.
Exactly. It's sort of the default setting, in a way, which makes the periods where trust was high seem even more remarkable.
Was there really a time when Americans, by and large, trusted the government?
Yes, surprisingly. The Brookings source points to a specific period, roughly from the start of the New Deal in 1933 through the mid-1960s. Trust in the federal government actually climbed significantly, hitting a peak of around 76%, trusting the government to do what's right most of the time in 1964.
76%. That sounds incredibly high from today's perspective. What drove that?
The source argues it was driven by perceived government effectiveness. Think about it. The government led the country through the Great Depression with the New Deal, won World War II, managed the early Cold War containment policy, and oversaw this incredible post-war economic boom that built a huge middle class.
So when government was seen as successfully tackling huge problems and delivering results people could see.
Trust went up. People saw like the system was working for them.
But obviously that didn't last. 76% feels like a distant memory.
It really does. The sources describe a pretty steep drop starting in the late 60s, early 70s, and it's often linked to a few major things hitting at once.
Like Vietnam and Watergate?
Exactly. Perceptions of government lying about the Vietnam War, followed by the Watergate scandal, which was just this raw display of presidential abuse of power and cover-up. Those were huge blows to public confidence.
Shook the foundations.
Deeply. And then you had economic problems layered on top. The runaway inflation in the late 70s, the feeling that government couldn't manage the economy, that eroded trust even further. By 1980, trust was down to just 25%.
Wow, from 76% to 25% in about 15 years.
It's a dramatic fall. And later events didn't help rebuild it. Things like financial crisis bailouts that seemed to help Wall Street more than Main Street, stimulus plans that didn't feel like they delivered on promises. Trust hit another near-record low around 19% in 2010.
So it's been a long, slow decline,
Yeah.
punctuated by these major crises. Where are we now, generally? Still pretty low.
Seems like it. Looking at more recent discussions, like the ones noted in that Reddit source you mentioned, the general sentiment reflects continued low trust. That source mentioned only about 1 in 4 Americans saying they trust most people, and that often reflects trust in institutions, too.
And people in those discussions point to a lot of different reasons for why trust is so low now.
Yeah, it's a whole mix of modern anxieties, things like the role of media, especially social media, maybe amplifying division and negativity. Political polarization is a huge one people mention. It's hard to trust the system when you feel like the other side is fundamentally wrong or acting in bad faith.
Right.
Others point to the decline of local communities, less face-to-face connection. Some feel there's just more untrustworthy behavior generally, while others focus on economic inequality, the sense that the system is rigged for the rich and powerful, that it's not fair.
It's striking, isn't it? Some of those factors people cite today, particularly that intense political polarization and high economic inequality, the sources say those are at levels not seen since.
Since the 1920s,
Yeah.
exactly. The era of Teapot Dome.
That parallel is really something.
It is. It suggests that maybe the conditions that breed mistrust have cyclical elements. Teapot Dome was this glaring example from that earlier era, powerful people abusing public office for personal gain, secret deals benefiting connected insiders, a sense that money trumped public interest. Scandals like that leave scars. They feed into this long-term narrative about whether government can be trusted, a narrative that echoes when similar conditions reappear.
And why is this erosion of trust such a big deal? Is it just a feeling, or does it have real consequences?
The Brookings source argues it has very real, very serious consequences. Deep public mistrust isn't just, bad vibes. It can actually undermine the functioning of democracy itself.
How so?
Well, think about it. If large numbers of citizens fundamentally don't trust their leaders, don't trust the institutions, maybe don't even trust each other that much, how can government work effectively? How can leaders build consensus? How can they ask people to make sacrifices for the common good, whether it's tackling climate change, dealing with the pandemic, or fixing the national debt?
It makes everything harder, gridlocked maybe.
Exactly. While a healthy skepticism towards power is good, it keeps leaders honest. Extreme cynicism or pervasive anti-government sentiment can become corrosive. It makes it harder to solve collective problems.
So Teapot Dome, this wild story from the Jazz Age involving oil, bribes, secret deals.
Yeah.
It wasn't just a blip. It was an early, very public lesson in how easily things can go wrong, how cronyism and greed can infect government, and how profoundly that damages the public's faith. And those lessons are still playing out today.
It really serves as a stark historical marker. It reminds us that these tensions between public service and private gain, between transparency and secrecy, between accountability and impunity, they're ongoing struggles.
Yeah.
The context changes, the players change, but the fundamental challenges remain.
Okay, so let's try to wrap up this deep dive into Teapot Dome. We've covered a lot of ground. We saw how these crucial naval oil reserves became the prize in a massive corruption scheme.
Right, orchestrated by Interior Secretary Albert Fall, who secretly leased them to his buddies, oil magnates Harry Sinclair and Edward Doheny.
And those leases came with a hefty price tag, millions in today's dollars, flowing into Fall's pockets through bribes disguised as loans and gifts, which eventually led to his conviction.
Making him the first U.S. cabinet secretary jailed for crimes committed in office. A truly historic, if infamous, milestone.
We also saw how the Senate investigation, driven by Senator Thomas Walsh, had to overcome major obstacles, records disappearing, witness intimidation. But ultimately, that investigation didn't just expose this scandal, it led to that crucial Supreme Court case, McGrain v. Doherty, which firmly established Congress's power to investigate the executive branch, a vital check on power.
And then there was that whole financial markets angle, the academic research showing pretty clear evidence of insider trading in Sinclair stock before the leases were public. Huge potential profits in that pre-SEC world.
Right. Profits possibly tempered only slightly by the fear of Walsh's investigation discovering the trades.
And we can't forget the troubling outcome where Fall went to prison for taking bribes, but Sinclair and Doheny largely avoided criminal conviction for paying them.
Yeah, that accountability gap still resonates. And eventually, decades later, the Teapot Dome Reserve itself was sold. But this time, transparently, through competitive bidding.
A long road to getting it right. Finally, we connected all this back to the bigger theme of public trust, seeing Teapot Dome as an early example contributing to American skepticism of government, and noting the parallels between the conditions of the 1920s high inequality, polarization, and our current struggles with trust.
So the key takeaways seem pretty clear. There's the constant danger of cronyism, the temptation for people in power to put their own interests first.
Definitely. And the absolute necessity of independent oversight, like those hard-fought congressional investigations, to hold power accountable. Their legal basis wasn't just handed to them, it had to be affirmed.
We also get a window into financial history, seeing insider trading before formal rules, and understanding the power of private information.
And maybe the biggest takeaway is just how fragile public trust is, and how scandals like Teapot Dome, even 100 years ago, shape the long-term story we tell ourselves about whether we can believe in our government.
It really makes you think, doesn't it?
It does.
So here's a final thought to leave you with. Think about how information travels today versus the 1920s, instant news, social media, everyone's a commentator. And think about our ongoing debates about transparency, lobbying, campaign finance, just basic trustworthiness. How would a scandal like Teapot Dome play out differently today? Would the speed of information make it harder to keep secrets, or easier to spread disinformation and confusion? Or underneath it all are the fundamental dynamics: who gets power, who benefits from it, and whether the rest of us can trust them? Are those things maybe more timeless than we sometimes think?
That's a really powerful question to ponder. Teapot Dome certainly gives us a lot of historical context for thinking about those very current issues.
It certainly does.
Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Teapot Dome scandal.